In number 2, a study about anorexia was conducted on 100 patients. Within the patient population, 70% were women, and 10% of the men were overweight as children. How many male patients in the study were not overweight as children? So just to go over some of the percent reminders or percent tips, that whenever you deal with percents, you need to convert the percent into its workable number. So there's actually 3 ways to do that. So 70% turns into 0.7. So whenever you do math with 70%, you would use 0.7. And the first way I did that was by just moving the decimal place 2 to the left. That's one way to get the math workable number. Another way is to turn the percent sign into 0.01. So it'd be 70 times 0.01, which if you did that in the calculator, you'd get 0.7. Another way is to turn the percent sign into 1 over 100, which likewise would give you 0.7. So these are just 3 different techniques you can use to turn that percent into the number that you can use in your calculation. So the other tip is to remember that whenever you want to calculate a percent of something, you multiply that percent number by whatever the number you're working with. So 70% of whatever, you do your 0.7 times whatever. So take a moment, figure out the problem, and then enter in your answer. Okay, so to go through this problem, it looks like we need to kind of do a little progression of what we know and find little bits of what we don't know yet. So when I see this, we know that there's 100 patients and 70% were women. Now our total goal was about, or our question was about how many men. So let's first figure out how many women there were based on the percent, and then we can figure out the number of men. So to set this up, we would do the 70% of the people equal really the number of women. Again, here I chose to use the 0.01 method. So if we type this in our calculator, 70% of 100 is 70, and you may have known that without even having to think about it, since there were 100 people. So that means that there were 70 women. Now, if there were 100 people total and 70 of them were women, if we subtract 100 or 70 from 100, that means that there are 100 men. Okay, so now we know how many men there are, and now we just need to figure out how many were not overweight. Well, they tell us that 10% of the men were overweight. So once we know how many men were overweight, we can then subtract that from 30 to figure out how many were not overweight. So we know 10% were overweight. So you have 30 times, sorry, let's start that again. We have 10% of those 30 men were overweight. I'll say OW. 10% of 30 is 3. Again, you may have known that without even having to do the whole calculation, which is fine. So 3 men were overweight. And since there were 30 men total, that means that there had to be 27 men that were not overweight as children. So the answer would be C.